Hello everyone, and welcome to the Strategies for Reducing Sodium in Schools webinar. I just want to mention quickly that this call is being recorded. I'm Matt Rittenhouse, and I'm with General Mills Food Service, and I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. Eleme Amagacher is a senior scientist with the Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition at General Mills. Eleme and the Bell Institute have a mission to nourish lives by educating and training professionals on meaningful health and nutrition topics. Eleme has her PhD in food science from Cornell University. Laura Thomas is a registered dietitian and is owner of Laura Thomas Nutrition Communications, LLC. Laura has been consulting in child nutrition for the past 10 years, working with a variety of organizations including the National Food Service Management Institute and the Idaho Department of Education. Laura has her master's degree in vocational education and adult education from the University of Idaho. Eleme will start by giving you a background of salt as it relates to taste, health, and food. Laura will then provide a few key strategies that you can use to reduce sodium on your menu. Please feel free to submit questions as we go during the presentation by typing them into the lower left-hand corner of the conference webinar screen. Our presenters will then answer your questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. Following the presentation, you'll receive an email with your CEU credit attached. So without further ado, here's Eleme to start you off with the history of salt.
Thank you, Matt. Let's start with a brief history of salt. Most people probably think of salt as the white food seasoning I put on my food to make it taste good. But salt is far more than that. Besides being one of the most effective and most widely used preservatives, the fact is that throughout history, it has been such an important element of human life that it is the subject of mythical and religious stories. So for example, you hear people say that if you spill salt, you need to throw some over your shoulder. And even today, the history of salt still touches our lives, as the word salary was derived from the word salt, as people were literally paid in salt. So what is salt? These days, there are many different kinds of salt. We hear about sea salt, kosher salt, table salt, but salt is salt. However, some of the main differences between these salts are their texture, the source of the salt, or how they are processed. So in essence, sodium chloride is an inorganic mineral, which means that it comes from the Earth's surface. It is present in the sea, and it forms into crystals when seawater evaporates. So what about salt makes it so desirable? Saltiness is considered a basic taste sensation, along with sweetness, bitterness, sourness, and umami. Taste preferences are innate, and most people like the taste of salt probably because of an inborn response that may reflect the body's need for sodium. Studies also indicate that learning and experience can also contribute to the positive appeal for salty taste. Hence, infancy and early childhood may be a critical time to establish taste preferences. Salt also interacts with other tastes to enhance the flavor of food. So what is the difference between salt and sodium? Now, although these terms, salt and sodium, are often used interchangeably, they are not exactly the same. Salt is actually made up of about 40% sodium and 60% chloride. Therefore, less salt equals less sodium. And 1 teaspoon of salt weighs about 6 grams and contains about 2,300 milligrams of sodium. Let's now turn our attention to sodium and food. But before we do that, I would like us to take a quick poll question. So here is the question. Within which food group is it most challenging to find lower sodium options? dairy, fruit, vegetables, grains, or meat alternates. So please go ahead and take a few moments to input your answer to this question. I see some answers coming in. We'll just take a few more moments. We are waiting for the last few to come in. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and close the poll. Okay. So as we can see here from our answers, the top three are meat alternates, dairy, and grains. And I'm sure as we go through the presentation, we will share some strategies with you that would help you to lower sodium in these food groups. Thank you for your responses. So let's move on. Salt has many functions in food and beverages. To name a few, it acts as a preservative in certain foods, creating a hostile environment where bacteria cannot grow, hence preventing spoilage. It also aids in texture formation and helps with the consistency of cheese. Salt also helps to control yeast fermentation in breads, resulting in that uniform grain and texture that we like in our breads. And lastly, salt enhances flavor and also increases the palatability of foods. So current sodium intake of Americans exceeds recommendations. For example, the 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends an intake of no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, which is about 1 teaspoon of salt. But current intakes actually hover around 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day. But however, there is a need to find a middle ground for sodium intake because some recent research reviewed by the Institute of Medicine questions how much is too low. According to the CDC, about 45% of sodium intake occurs for children occurs during breakfast and lunch. And sodium intakes in children tend to increase over time for school-aged children. So therefore, there is an opportunity to significantly impact sodium intakes in school meals. Now, as you can see in this chart, sodium can be found in nearly every food in the food supply. And although reducing sodium, the sodium content of processed or packaged foods is an avenue to reducing sodium intakes, there are other critical components. So components like a broader shift in dietary food patterns and also nutrition education. And these components must be implemented to successfully reduce sodium intakes by Americans. Now, as we discussed earlier in the presentation, salt and other sodium-containing ingredients may serve many purposes beyond taste. And so a big challenge for the food industry is reducing sodium without sacrificing taste, functionality, or food safety. Let's now turn our attention to sodium and health. As you may know, there are many functions of sodium in the body, but for our purposes today, we'll just highlight a few. The body requires sodium to maintain health. And when sodium is consumed in adequate amounts, it helps maintain a balance of fluids and also influences the contraction and relaxation of muscles. The kidneys regulate the body's sodium levels and the volume of water circulating in the body. So in healthy individuals, excess sodium will pass out through urine and perspiration. Now, high blood pressure or hypertension is a condition that affects about 67 million American adults, and that's about 1 in every 3 American adults. And scientific evidence suggests that sodium reduction does decrease blood pressure. But however, sodium-reduced diets may not be the only solution for all individuals with high blood pressure because not everyone is sodium sensitive. Now, while public health officials view reducing sodium intake as the primary strategy to lower blood pressure, strategies that encourage lifestyle modifications are also very essential. And these strategies may include a diet that emphasizes the consumption of fruits, of vegetables, fat-free or low-fat dairy, whole grains, and lean meats. And this is also a key recommendation from the 2010 dietary guidelines and the current school meal program. Now, another dietary strategy is to increase sodium intake because is to increase potassium intake because as more potassium is consumed, more sodium is excreted out of the body through the urine. And additionally, potassium helps to relax blood vessel walls, which also helps to lower blood pressure. And finally, regular physical activity and maintaining a healthy body weight are among other lifestyle modifications that can be incorporated to help lower blood pressure. So ultimately, beyond the benefits of decreasing blood pressure alone, a public health focus on decreasing sodium intakes aims to assist in reducing the risk of heart disease across the population. And to adjust taste acceptance, a gradual reduction of sodium in foods may be a successful approach. So why reduce sodium in school meals? Although only 9% of children's sodium intake is attributed to school meals, the goal of school meals is to provide students with healthy foods and food patterns that will help influence their lifelong habits. And in children, eating habits and attitudes about food that are formed during their childhood are very likely to influence eating habits for life. And since the work you do each day will carry into the future, there is a great opportunity here to reduce sodium in our schools. Now, moreover, as you all know, level 1 of USDA's mandated sodium targets are in effect starting this school year, and therefore the time to act is now. So I will go ahead and take questions at the end of the presentation, and so I will now hand over to Laura to give you some strategies for reducing sodium in our schools.
Thank you, Aleme. And that was a great background piece to put this into context and help us to move forward in terms of looking at strategies that we can employ to reduce sodium in the meals that are offered in schools. So I'm going to move to our next slide. And just as a reminder, we talked about the sodium targets are now in effect in the meal pattern. And we're looking at that first target of 2014-15, which is in effect this year. The guidance, the rule is for a gradual reduction over approximately from the rules, when the rules were introduced, a 10-year time frame with intermediate targets to help us move down the sodium. So right now we're looking at this level 1 target, and that's where we're going to focus. Most of today's presentation is on what we need to be doing today. As Aleme said, the time to take action is now. So we're going to go and identify some lower sodium options. That's our first strategy. And to give us a context for that, we need to talk about the foods that are required in the food patterns. We saw earlier in the presentation a very nice graphic, a pie chart of where the typical American diet, where sodium is found in the food choices of the nation as a whole. This slide is intended to help us recognize that there's a continuum of lower sodium choices to higher sodium choices within each one of those component food groups. And I do want to make the point that this does not indicate a consistent amount of sodium left to right. So that is not what we're depicting here. For instance, fruit is a very low sodium food, and it's the continuum here is just to indicate there are differences in choices. So I want to be very clear about that we're looking at the continuum of lower sodium to higher sodium within the food groups. And let's review those by each component group. So fluid milk has naturally occurring sodium. And you're going to see it on a food label at about 125 to 130 milligrams per cup of unflavored, plain, or fat-free milk. Our higher sodium end of that continuum would be flavored milk such as chocolate. So we have a range there. I mentioned earlier that fruits in general are very low sodium, and we're going to see a range of somewhere maybe up to 10 milligrams per cup from this component group. So you can see that's very low in terms of sodium, almost negligible. When we move to vegetables, that's where we see a lot more variation in natural sodium. For example, 1 cup of celery has less sodium than 1 cup of potato, both of those being raw products. That sodium that we find in celery may be one of the reasons that celery is often a key ingredient in making soup. It may be there, we may be using it to help develop the flavor profile of soup. Now, fresh fruits and vegetables are going to be lower in sodium, also the frozen versions of those. And then when we get to canned vegetables, we're going to see some additional variation. Canned vegetables have the canning process. There's salt added that's required for the canning process. And we will see variations between products. But there are also vegetables that are canned with a lower sodium content. If you see the label claim low sodium on a label, it means that there's less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. And many USDA foods that are canned are following this level of sodium, such as green beans. So you want to look at the food label and recognize that the portion size listed on the food label is going to be the one that the Food and Drug Administration requires, which may be different than our component size we're looking at, depending on if it's a half cup or a full cup portion. So, and also you don't want to forget to check your frozen vegetables for any sodium content if something's been added in a sauce or something. And then remember, if you salt food, you're going to have to account for the salt that's added. When we move on to the grain group, again we see some variation. Natural grains, the cereal grains are naturally low in sodium, and many grain-based foods such as rice or pasta can be prepared without the addition of salt. So they can be very low in terms of the sodium content that they're providing, maybe 10 to 20 milligrams per ounce equivalent. For functional purposes, however, when grains are prepared into breads and wraps, tortillas, ready-to-eat cereals, salt is added during preparation, and that often will result in a product that has a labeled sodium value of anywhere from 115 to maybe 200 or 300 milligrams per ounce equivalent. Again, it's depending on the product. So we have variation there. And then finally, we're looking at the meat and meat alternates, which may also vary in the amount of sodium. Now, when we look at fresh meats, so meats that like beef and pork, fish, and poultry, we're looking at, on average, somewhere around 100 milligrams of sodium per ounce equivalent that's naturally occurring. Then if we're looking at cured or processed meats or canned items, they usually have salt added and other sources of sodium added during the processing of them to make them safe. And that is going to increase the sodium content of those particular products, sometimes up to 200 to 300 milligrams, maybe 400 per ounce equivalent. Yogurt is a meat alternate that is lower in sodium, and it has probably around 50 to 70 milligrams of sodium per ounce equivalent. Nut butters are traditionally made with salt added, although you can purchase some salted varieties, or they can be made. And then the last of our meat alternates is cheese. Cheese takes that milk product that has some naturally occurring sodium. Salt is used in the cheese making process. So cheese is going to be higher on the continuum compared to milk. Natural cheeses are going to be lower in sodium than processed cheeses. And we saw in that earlier poll that this was one of the food groups that people are having some concerns about finding lower sodium options. So we're going to explore this a little bit more in the presentation. So we know now a little bit of the amount of sodium to expect to find in different food groups, but where do we find sodium values? Well, one of them is that nutrition facts panel, and you can see this here on this particular product. It's circled in red. But what do you do for products that don't have a nutrition facts panel, like say fruits and vegetables or things that don't have a label? Well, the Foodipedia tool that's found at the USDA Super Tracker is a wonderful resource. We're going to show you some information from it a little later in the presentation. It draws upon the the incredible USDA database that has thousands of foods, condiments, combination foods. So it can really give you some guidance in terms of just trying to find some numbers. One of the things I want to point out is that food labels follow the rounding rules. So you will always see the sodium listed in numbers that are divisible by 5. So you see the 110 here. You might see 25 on another label. When you're in Foodipedia, you're going to be seeing the database, and so you may be seeing some odd numbers, 27, 163, and that's the reason, is that the food label is using rounding rules and the database is giving you the actual number from the database. Okay, so we've got a little bit of base knowledge. Now we're going to move on to looking at how we can modify our choices within the meal patterns. And it's probably a good time for us to review some of that information. But before we do that, we're going to ask a poll question, and that is, what's your biggest concern when it comes to lowering sodium on your menu? Is it that the student response to lower sodium meals, or the extra time and effort it takes to plan menus that meet the regulations? Or is it finding a sufficient array of products that will meet your needs as well as the regulations? So here's the poll question. We're going to give you a few seconds really, to select your choice. So go ahead and fill in the circle and then hit submit. And we're seeing those answers coming in right now. And we'll give you just a couple more seconds. If you haven't clicked yet, go ahead and submit your answer. And now we're going to move forward to the results. Okay, so here we see that it's almost fairly equally split between finding products that meet needs and the student response. And that's probably because those two things are connected, making sure that students like the products that we have available. Well, we recognize that there are menu challenges, and one of the top ones is how to keep the student favorite choices on your menu. You also have some budget constraints, and you need to have a variety of foods. So we're going to address these concerns as we walk through some strategies to help you balance out these choices. Want to review again the level 1 sodium targets, and we're going to specifically start looking at breakfast to begin with. So at the K5 level, we can see that it's less than 540 milligrams of sodium across the menu week. That's a daily average. It's not a daily requirement. It's an average across the week. And 6-8, 600 milligrams, 9 through 12, 640. Now, if you're using a combination menu, say a K8, or even in the instance of breakfast where you can actually do a K12 if you want to, you need to make sure that you're using the sodium level for the youngest group. So if you do a K8, you want to use the K5 value for sodium so that you're meeting the regulation. And if we look at what's required for breakfast, we have some required components, and those are milk, fruit, and whole grain rich grains. We need to have 1 cup of milk and 1 cup of fruit, plus 1 ounce equivalent of whole grain rich grain offered each day as a minimum in our breakfast. We also need to meet our requirements for the average daily calories. Make sure that less than 10% of the calories for the meal across the week average is coming from saturated fat. We're purchasing products that are labeled 0 grams trans fat per serving. And now we have the sodium target for our grade groups. One way to look at this is if we start looking at the required breakfast components. And so I'm going to look at milk and fruit. We know we have to offer a cup of milk and a cup of fruit every breakfast day. If we take the lower sodium level I talked about for milk, so about 125 milligrams, and we take the higher number I gave for fruit, which was 10 milligrams for a cup, add those together, that's 135 milligrams of sodium. We basically need to plan to have that much of the sodium in the meal dedicated to those two food groups. And because those are constants, that makes it kind of easy for us to look at that the rest of the sodium requirement, somewhere between 400 and 500 milligrams, depending on the grade group, is available for the grains and the other foods that we're going to be using to meet the requirements. We have 3 strategies that we're going to go over specific to breakfast. And we're going to look at a K5 breakfast menu and use those standards because they have the lowest sodium restriction or lowest sodium level that we're trying to meet. So our strategies are going to be to menu higher sodium foods with lower sodium foods. And we're going to see an example of that. And then we're going to look at varying the grains that are offered. And then the final strategy we're going to look at is how to menu lower sodium meat and meat alternates at breakfast. So here is a breakfast menu, kind of traditional. It's been served someplace across the nation. And we can see the values for different amounts of sodium are behind the food item. That's the number in parentheses. And then we have our totals for each day. And when we look at this particular menu, it exceeds our level 1 targets because the menu average is 612 milligrams. And so we're exceeding the target right there. So what we're going to do is look at how menuing higher sodium foods with lower sodium foods across the menu week might be a strategy to employ. So here's our menu again, and we're calling attention right now to the chocolate milk. Now we remember we always have to offer 2 choices of milk. But if we're offering chocolate milk, chances are it may be the predominant milk choice. So that's the reason we put the sodium value for the chocolate milk in. This is fat-free chocolate milk. If we were to take an approach and substitute in strawberry flavored milk, it has roughly the same sodium value as the plain unflavored milk. So we're already offering that, the 125 milligrams. Strawberry flavoring doesn't have additional sodium. So this could be a simple swap in flavored milks at breakfast. And what we find that happening is that it takes the menu from 612 milligrams down to 537 milligrams average across the week. One simple swap. The rest of the menu didn't need to be changed. That's just under the 540 milligram target we have for K through 5 for this 14-15 school year. So that's one strategy. Now, if we look at another strategy, that's varying the grains that are offered. We can see how to take and make that same base menu, but we've highlighted some foods here because we want to keep that biscuits and sausage gravy on Friday. It's a favorite of our students, and we want to be able to keep that on the menu, just as we were able to keep it the last menu cycle. So let's look at what we might do to change some choices and see what the result is. So we're going to switch out the whole wheat bagel and peanut butter with some ready-to-eat cereal and a half of an English muffin. Now, one thing I want to call your attention to is we've selected a ready-to-eat cereal that has a lower amount of sodium from the ranges. If you look at the cereal labels, this one has a lower amount of sodium in the product. It is absolutely key that as you're looking at your products, you make sure you have the most current information from your suppliers, your manufacturers. If you look at a label that you are maybe serving the exact same cereal and you've been serving it for 3, 4, 5 years, and you look at a label that you had on that product previously, maybe it's 2, 3 years old, but you're thinking, oh, it's the same cereal. You need to look at the new label because manufacturers are helping you with this, and the sodium level most likely has been decreased. So you want to make sure that you're using the accurate information. The next menu day, we've swapped out some pancakes. And then we're showing another grain variation on Wednesday, and that is that we're having oatmeal, a cooked grain. Remember I talked about that the cereal grains naturally are low in sodium. This particular amount of sodium, 65 milligrams, say in a half cup portion, a 1 ounce equivalent, that is equal to if you were to reconstitute non-fat dry milk and use it as the cooking liquid, or if you were to use, say, a teaspoon of salt in 35 servings. So it's not heavily salted. It's got some for flavor, but then we might be adding some other things to the oatmeal there as well. So that's the strategy there, is to introduce a cooked grain. We have granola bars the next day that help us accommodate a lower sodium as well. And look, we're going to keep that sausage and biscuit gravy favorite meal. And wow, this menu now is at 522 milligrams of sodium average across the week with those variations in grain. And what I want to call your attention to is that we kept the chocolate milk. If you were to apply the strategy of also swapping to strawberry milk, the flavored milk without additional sodium in the flavoring, this would go even lower and would start working you towards that level 2 requirement that's coming down the road. So something to keep in mind. But we're able to keep those student favorites on. Now let's take and turn our attention to lower sodium meat alternates and how those might be useful to us, because we do have the choice. There is flexibility in the breakfast program. We're not required to serve meat alternates. And if we do choose to serve meat alternates, we have a choice in that we can choose to credit them for additional grain once we have offered the 1 ounce equivalent of grain each day, or we can choose to include them as an extra in the meal so they are not a component in our reimbursable offer versus serve type meal. But the calories, the sodium, and saturated fat do count towards our dietary specifications. So we have some flexibility here. We're going to show you again that menu, and we're picking on the Tuesday and the Friday to show you a change. And if we were to put yogurt with granola on that Tuesday menu, and then on the Friday you see we have a cheese omelet with a muffin, another very popular choice. And I know a lot of schools will have variations where they'll have a couple of days a week that they swing out some of those popular choices. Again, this is a higher sodium menu as well, not quite as high as the biscuits and sausage gravy. But look, we're at 533 milligrams of sodium. And again, it has the chocolate milk on it. So if we were to swap out to strawberry milk, we would have additional sodium savings and possibly be working towards, again, that level 2 target that's coming down the road later. Let's turn our, that just jumped way too fast. Let's turn our attention back to lunch and talk about the levels that we're looking at in the 2014-15 school year. Breakfast, if you recall the numbers for breakfast, when you know your calorie ranges for each grade group, we have about a milligram of sodium per calorie to work with at the breakfast lunch menu, or the breakfast meal pattern. At lunch, it's about 2 milligrams of sodium per calorie for the K-5 age grade group, and just slightly less than that for the 9 through 12 group. Again, I want to remind you that if you're using a combination menu, a K-8 in the case of lunch is the one you can put together, you want to use the K-5 value for sodium so that you're in compliance with the lowest sodium group, level group that you're supposed to be meeting. So now let's take a look at what we are required to have at lunch and review, again, that continuum of sodium naturally occurring in our food components. So our milk going to have at least 125 milligrams of sodium for the unflavored, and if we go up to the chocolate, it will be 200 or maybe slightly less. Again, you've got to check your label, your manufacturer. Our fruit, up to 10 milligrams per cup. And we're looking at high school, so we're using those 1 cup portions. This is the menu group. We're going to go to the older age group for the lunch example. Vegetables are fresh and frozen, somewhere between 10 to 100 milligrams of sodium in that 1 cup portion. If it's processed with salt, we might have up to 500 milligrams per cup. It depends on the product. You really have to look at the label. Now grains, we are going to be offering them in 1 ounce equivalents, but sometimes that will be 2 of the same item. If we're doing a sandwich, we might have 2 slices of whole wheat bread. So the numbers that you see there under sodium are for 1 ounce equivalents, and the times 2 is whatever our choice is. We're going to have to make sure that we get 2 ounce equivalents minimum to meet our pattern. Sometimes it's the same product, as I said, the slices of bread, but sometimes it's a different product. We might be using something like a pasta for 1 ounce equivalent and then maybe a slice of bread or some other item for the other. So there may be variation in between the 2 grain options that make our 2 ounce equivalent total. We're going to see the same thing with our meat and meat alternates. Some of them are going to be lower per ounce equivalent and some will be higher, and sometimes we're going to use 2 of the lower ones. We might use a baked chicken breast, which would be lower in sodium at the lower end of the continuum, or we might be using, say, an ounce of cheese and maybe an ounce of ham, which would take us to the higher end of the continuum. Again, it just depends on the menu item that we're using. Again, a quick review of the daily lunch pattern menu, that we have to offer certain foods, which is why we have more sodium to work with at lunchtime. So we have minimum serving sizes to offer, and we also have those calorie ranges to work within. This is very familiar to everyone. So we're going to go through 3 different strategies that we might employ at lunch, different from the ones that we covered at breakfast. And the first one is to use some on-site blending for lower sodium products. The next one we'll talk about will be portion control for higher sodium foods. And then our last strategy will be some ideas for breakfast for lunch and how that can help us out. So let's look at blending on-site. I mentioned Foodipedia earlier in the presentation, and this is a screenshot of the website. And what we've been able to do is bring up 2 products to do side-by-side comparison. And that's a very nice feature of Foodipedia. You can compare 2 products, so it can help you make some choices. We have a traditionally prepared tomato sauce in a ½ cup portion. And in the red circle you see that it has over 500 milligrams of sodium in that ½ cup. And then we have a low sodium tomato sauce that has less than 40 milligrams. It's got 37 milligrams of sodium. Remember I said labels will be rounded, and you're seeing the actual numbers here from the database. So if we were to take and use just the low sodium tomato sauce to make a lasagna or other casserole, it may not have enough flavor for our students. And my experience in working in a school district is that sometimes if the product doesn't have enough flavor, then the cooks in the kitchen might want to do something to change that, and they might actually add more salt to it than maybe would be in the product if we had a different product choice. The idea of blending is that if we were to take half of the regular tomato sauce for our recipe and the other half coming from the low sodium, blend them together, now we're going to have a product that's somewhere, instead of 500 milligrams per ½ cup from the regular sauce, we're going to be somewhere around 270 milligrams when we add those together and basically dilute the salt through both products. It's going to have a flavor profile that may be more acceptable, and when we add our own garlic powder and onion powder and maybe some dried herbs, we can adjust and create our own custom sauce. It may be an easy way for staff to be able to manage these sodium restrictions gradually. Now, the other thing we want to think about is that we can start with this and then we can continue the process. We may discover that while we might have started off with half of each type of product, eventually we could get to a 1/3 of the regular tomato sauce and 2/3 of the lower sodium sauce combined with our additional seasonings. So it allows us some flexibility at the local level, and yet we're using standardized products that make it easier for our staff to work with. So let's take a look at a lunch example that actually uses that lower sodium sauce we created. And here we have a piece of a homemade lasagna with a whole grain rich noodle, lean ground beef, part skim mozzarella. We're using that lower sodium blend we made, and because we added a little bit of seasoning to it, we rounded up to 300 milligrams just to cover any additional bit of sodium that might come from something else. We've got a whole grain rich breadstick, a cup of romaine lettuce, some fresh apple slices, and chocolate milk. And that meal has about 900 milligrams of sodium in it. So you can see how using that blending technique really helped us drop the sodium in this particular menu item. But oh, there is something missing. What? Yes, salad dressing. The salad dressing, we're probably not going to serve that romaine lettuce without dressing, and salad dressing has anywhere from 150 to 300 milligrams of sodium in a 2 tablespoon or so portion. So it really depends on your product and how you make it, if you make it fresh yourself or the purchasing of your product. Many different varieties out there available to us. And that is going into our next topic of using portion control for higher sodium foods. That last menu, even with the 300 milligrams of sodium from salad dressing, took that total menu to about 1,200 milligrams. So we were still able to combine the blending of the tomato product with portion control of the salad dressing and still be under the level 1 target that we're working towards. So let's take a look at where we can find more information about condiments and sodium, because that is oftentimes one of the sources of sodium we're going to have to pay attention to and have to use portion control. This data came from the Foodipedia. Looked up some basic information. So if you don't have sodium information on some of your condiment packages, this would be a place to get at least an estimate. And again, looking at condiments, they have some great flavors that we like. We just need to learn to balance them in. So for instance, if we were to take and make a stir-fry option that used brown rice and vegetables and an unseasoned type of meat, so a chicken or beef, and then we used some soy sauce to make a sauce that went over this, and maybe we put in some pineapple and some fresh ginger to give it some additional flavor, but put a sauce over it. By using the lower sodium choices from our continuum of the grains and vegetables and meat alternates, we're able to use more sodium in the sauce that would go over the top, and by adding the pineapple and ginger, we might create, again, a custom sauce that has very flavorful and delivers what our students want. We're going to add our cup of fruit and offer our cup of milk with this, and that's a meal that could come in at around maybe 1,250 milligrams of sodium if we were working with different products. So another example of how to make it work for us. But portion control on condiments is going to be an important aspect of meeting the sodium guidelines. Our last strategy we're going to look at is to serve breakfast for lunch. And that slide just jumped ahead way too quickly, so we're going to go back to those pictures. So one of the things we can employ from breakfast when we were balancing lower and higher sodium food choices is we could serve breakfast for lunch. And let's say we created a sort of a skillet dish that featured maybe some higher sodium sausage, but we mixed it with potatoes and onions and peppers, fresh or frozen, to create a dish. So we're extending that sausage through the potatoes and onions. We serve it with pancakes, orange wedges, milk, and we have a meal that's coming in for around 1,250 milligrams of sodium. So again, it's a way for us to bank some of that sodium saved. It's under our target for high school and would be a way for us to save some for another menu item. Another popular item that we could put on our lunch menu would be a fruit parfait. And we could make this into a grab-and-go type of lunch. We've got the yogurt for our meat alternate and the yogurt or granola bars for the grain with a cup of fruit, a cup of vegetables, and milk. And that particular meal, when we look at the sodium, could be as low as 500 milligrams for the entire lunch. And it's one of those grab-and-go type of options could be very popular. So it's a way to have, again, another balancing choice across the menu. Okay, so let's take a look at some approaches to strategies for recipes to see how we might employ this even differently than the strategies we've talked about in terms of just the food choices in our menus. But before we do that, we want to ask you this question. With Tier 1 or the Level 1, Target 1 sodium levels now in effect, what have you seen impact your operation the most? Is it participation, increased costs, increased labor needs, or none of these issues? So let's go to that poll question and give you a chance to answer. Okay, and we'll give you just a couple more seconds. We see them rolling in, and give you just a couple more seconds to answer this poll question, and then we'll close it up. And it looks like the answers have stabilized a bit. So, okay, and we're seeing participation and food increased costs, and I might be assuming that those are food costs. Oh, we're seeing some changes here, but still the trends are still the same. Okay, thank you for participating in these polls. It's really quite fun to have your input in it. Well, as we look at reducing sodium in recipes, the one thing we want to look at is to gradually reduce the amounts to find that lower sodium option that maintains the taste that our students are looking for. You need to test your recipes. Again, using those ideas of blending the sauce and using other herbs and things. Another idea, we have 5 strategies that you can use, and one that's similar to that blending idea is to add vegetables or whole grains to other prepared foods. So you might be adding, say, onions and kale and peppers to a sloppy joe mix and call it something creative like Scarecrow Joes or something like that. You might be adding vegetables and grain to a tomato soup and then call it garden tomato soup. Or you may be adding some additional vegetables and items to chili, so vegetables like corn and squash and green beans, and call it Three Sisters chili and connect it to Native American cuisine. The key about this is you're kind of taking the same approach of diluting the sodium in that product by adding the vegetables or grains, but you need to check your recipe yield and you need to recalculate your components because you want to make sure you have those correct for your serving information. You can balance days with higher and lower sodium offerings. So we saw that yogurt used as a meat alternate can be a strategy to put into place. And then we can get students interested in different flavors, fresh herbs particularly. So you could have a window seal herb garden and then use those herbs in low sodium dips or dressings. You might even enlist classrooms that are interested in the gardening curriculums to help you with this. What about having a flavor bar where you have shakers of spice blends or herb blends that students could use to punch up the flavor of their own meals? Not every student likes cayenne pepper, but some do. So if you had it available, it's a low sodium choice, but it could add some additional flavor. They can add it to their food. And then finally, you could create some lower sodium alternatives by adding yogurt to commercially prepared salad dressings or make your own. So we're going to have a recipe challenge real quickly here. We've got a Southwest salad with romaine lettuce, black beans, corn, chicken, cheese, and salsa with our whole grain tortilla chips, banana, and milk. And it has about 620 milligrams of sodium in it. And by applying the various strategies that we've talked about with menu choices, we can make it lower by using a low sodium taco seasoning on the meat. We can use natural cheese instead of processed. We can use canned corn or frozen without added salt. We can do the same with the black beans. And if we're using canned, we can drain and rinse them. All of these choices are going to help us keep chocolate milk on the menu, and we might serve a whole grain cookie, which is a student favorite that helps with participation. We could design a custom dressing that would be half salsa and half yogurt to further reduce the sodium from just the salsa alone. And as an interesting twist, we could use a spicy cereal mix for intense flavor on the top, so that there's really an interesting flavor for students that adds some wow. And this meal now is 1,100 milligrams of sodium. So all of these little strategies put together can make some very significant differences. Lastly, we want to encourage everyone to be positive. Everyone on staff needs to be encouraging about what is happening. Let's talk about the fresh and spicy and juicy and crunchy items that we're offering on the menus, and not talk about, oh, we had to take the salt away. Let's use some menu descriptors that are exciting. Let's offer some students samples of new items prior to featuring them on the menu so they know what to expect. They might stick with the tried and true and not try the new item if they don't know what it tastes like. And we need to bring the greater community on board, our school staff, administration, teachers, parents. Maybe offer samples to them at meetings so that they know what great tastes we're offering and enlist their help. So in recap, we've covered salt in our sense of taste, sodium in health and food, some lower sodium options, some ideas for menu patterns and menu planning, and then we've taken a fresh approach to recipes. And at this time, I think we're going to go back to Matt and have some questions.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thank you, Eleme. Now we'll just take a few minutes to ask Laura and Eleme questions that the audience submitted. And before I do so, we just received a few questions regarding the availability of this presentation. And I just want to let everybody know that a recording of this webinar and the presentation slides will be available within the next 2 days or so. And you could look those up in two different areas. They will be posted to bellinstitute.com and to generalmillscf.com. And to make it easy for you, a link will be included in the email that you receive that has your CEU credit attached to that. So keep an eye out for that email. It will have all the pertinent information that you need. So with that, I'll start off with a question that we got, and this is for Eleme. Eleme, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, here's a question for you. Should we be concerned that children will get too much potassium as products are reformulated to reduce sodium?
So thank you. That's actually a very good question. No, we do not have concerns that children will be getting too much potassium. Potassium is actually just one of the levers we use when we reduce sodium in products. And also, the daily recommended levels of potassium for children is about 3,500 milligrams per day. And children and adolescents ages from 6 to 18 years actually consume around 2,300 milligrams of potassium a day. So we are not concerned at all that children will have too much potassium.
Thank you so much, Eleme. And I'm actually just looking as more questions are coming in. The next question is for Laura. Laura, are there any strategies on when to use canned vegetables versus when to use fresh vegetables? And do you have any examples?
Oh, that's an excellent question, because I think as we're making menu modifications and we have different choices available to us, we should look to the product we want to use. It may mean having a couple of items in inventory. An example I can think of is that when a product is going to be mixed into something, so a soup or a casserole, going with the lesser expensive, lower sodium canned product may be an absolutely perfect choice. We're going to drain off the liquid. But when we're putting that vegetable on the center of the plate, we want people to see it for the quality, we may want to choose something different. So canned corn. Some of the sodium in canned corn helps keep the texture and the color there, so that might be a choice that we would make when we're serving it as a separate vegetable, or frozen corn in that case. Fresh corn is probably not one that most people are serving very often, But that would be an example. I think that we want to look at what is the application of it, and then see where we can have sodium savings where we're also meeting those other characteristics we want of eye appeal and the presentation of the food. So sometimes using our products slightly differently for different applications on the menu would be something to look at.
Thanks so much, Laura. Okay, the next question is for Eleme. Eleme, are the 6-cent certification sheets to monitor sodium on the school menus available?
No.
Oh, yes. Actually, Eleme, let me jump in here. I do know the answer to this one. I don't mean to interrupt. If you go to the certification of compliance worksheets for school meals, USDA's certification of compliance worksheets, they have included a sodium calculator on those to help you get some estimates of your sodium. So that tool is available. And of course, anyone who's using nutrition analysis software will have an estimate as well on theirs. Now, you're not required to use nutrition analysis software in school meals, but some schools do choose to do that. But the certification of compliance sheets do have a sodium calculator on those sheets now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Okay, this next question is for Eleme. Eleme, when you wash canned vegetables, how do you calculate the sodium reduction from the labels?
Okay, so when you wash canned vegetables, you actually remove approximately 1/3 of the sodium. So then you can just factor in that amount in your calculations. Take out 1/3 from the total amount.
And I definitely, if I can jump in here again, I think that needs to definitely be a step on your standardized recipe that tells your staff to do that as part of the recipe preparation, so that you can put a notation that that you're using that approximation reduction, so that it's a standardized approach in your kitchen. Make sure you document it well.
Actually, that's a great point, Laura, and a good segue to the last question that we'll be able to ask given the time we have. And so for you, Laura, what are some strategies we can use to get cafeteria workers on board with changes?
Oh, I believe every single one of us can make each day we can have a different purpose in life. So when we look at that, yes, our job is to prepare and serve meals, but really the purpose of my job here is to create a healthier generation and to enable students to do better in life. That's part of it. Part of it is just an attitude change, and part of it is understanding that when we market the healthy choices and we encourage people, we can actually increase participation. Sometimes adults are harder to change than children. And so just really talking about this tastes good, giving choices, asking, would you like the broccoli or the green beans? Would you like pears or a banana? Encouraging those foods that are lower in sodium naturally on our menu. And then just talking to them about the interesting flavors and expanding our own choices at home. So there's a whole package there, but I do believe that we play a huge role in putting a positive outlook on great tasting foods that schools are working so hard to do. I so appreciate the work that everyone does every day in the kitchens across the country.
Great. Thanks for that, Laura. Okay, well, we had an influx of a lot of great questions. I apologize, but we just simply ran out of time, and we won't be able to answer all of your questions for today. But with that, we'll need to conclude the webinar. And what I want to do is just thank all of our entire audience, all of the attendees today. We know you're all extremely busy, so thank you for taking the time to attend the webinar. And again, you will be receiving an email follow-up soon with links to resources. And we just wish that you have a great day, and thanks again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the conference call for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines.